when we talk about soil properties, we're really talking about the ability of soil to help plants grow. And since plants are the basis for the biopyramid, for food that we eat on Earth, soil is really the basis for all life. So I'm going to go over some very common soil properties, some terms that you may or may not have heard of. And don't panic because you don't need to memorize all of these, but this is just so that you're familiar with them. Sometimes when you go to buy fertilizer, you'll see some of these terms if you're a gardener, or if you are a farmer. If you've ever worked on a farm or talked to a farmer, you've probably heard a lot of these terms. So let's start out with the three categories of common soil properties. There are chemical properties, physical properties, and biological properties associated with soils. And when soil scientists describe a soil, they tend to talk about all of these different properties because they all determine the health of the soil and whether it can grow plants. So if we start with chemical properties, the term pH, I'm sure you've heard of. pH is how acidic or basic the soil is when water is present. And so you can't really measure the pH of soil if you just stick a pH meter into the soil unless the soil is wet. You have to have water in there to dissolve the chemicals on the outer surface of the soil, and that tells you the pH. So you're really taking the pH of the water that's in the pore spaces between the soil particles. The next, total carbon just refers to how much organic matter there is in the soil. And then nutrients we measure in terms of NPK. So if you go buy fertilizer, you'll see on the label it always has the NPK ratio. And that's how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium is present in that fertilizer. But when we're measuring soils, we also want to know how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium is present in that soil to that it can be provided to plants so plants can grow. Cation exchange capacity, or CEC, that refers to the surface area and binding sites on a soil. And that's important because these binding sites on the surface of soil particles determines how many nutrients a soil can hold on to. Okay, so moving on to our physical properties, there's a whole long list of these, and we'll go through most of them. Bulk density. So texture we're going to talk about in detail later on, and it just refers to what percentage of silt, sand, and clay is in the soil. So that's referring to the percentage of the different sizes of particles. Bulk density is talking about how compacted the soil is compared to its volume. So if you have a really fluffy soil, that's a low bulk density. If you have a really dense, heavy soil, that would be a high bulk density. Water holding capacity says that that's talking about if you filled up the soil's pore spaces between, so the spaces between the soil particles, how much water can it hold? And then water infiltration rate is aligned with, but not exactly, it's not the same thing as water holding capacity, and that looks at how fast water can drain through those soil pores when water hits the surface of the soil. Porosity is referring to how much pore space is available between the soil particles, and then aeration talks about how much air can get into that soil. So sometimes soils get compacted, so you can imagine if you walk on a soil or if you drive a truck over a soil, it's going to compress it, and then those soil particles are closer together and air can't get into those pore spaces, and plants need air in order to grow. The roots need air. Okay, so moving on to the biological properties of the soil. A soil scientist is concerned about what's in the soil that's living. And so they might want to know how many bacteria and fungi are there. There's about 10 to the 6, so 1 million to 1 billion bacteria per gram of soil. And fungi, there's a ton of fungi. They're mostly in the top layers of soil because they're bigger cells and they can't get down through the soil column, as well as bacteria. Respiration rate. So how much carbon dioxide is coming off of that soil and how fast can oxygen get in to the soil. And then small critters that are in the soil. So often scientists will take a sample of the soil and count the number of nematodes or earthworms or arthropods, so different little bugs that live in the soil. And then finally, decomposition rate would refer to how fast something gets decomposed when it falls on the soil surface by these different organisms. Okay, so the two factors you should know from this lecture that influence soil properties are, number one, the amount of organic matter that's present in the soil, and number two, the amount of clay sediments that are present in the soil. Both of these are important because that determines how much surface area is available compared to the volume of soil that can absorb nutrients and hold on to water in the soil. And so these are critically important. So organic matter, that's, how much organic matter gets incorporated into the soil as organic matter is decomposed. And then clay sediments, clay is the smallest sized sediment of soil. And the more clay that you have, the more water and nutrients your soil can hold on to. This is a nice picture of a structure called a PED, and these have angular blocky structures. These are present if you find a soil that has PEDs in it. That means it has a high clay content, and whenever the clay dries out, it's going to form these little, they look like rocks, but when you saturate them, they will all stick together again to form one piece of soil. So, but as they dry out, they kind of break apart, and you get these little PEDs. Okay, so we said the two things that are critically important in soil are how much organic matter is there and how much clay is there. So where does the organic matter come from? Just to remind you, it comes from breaking down organic matter that falls onto the surface of the soil from trees, plants, cactus, whatever happens to be growing in your soil. And there's a number of different living organisms that break this down. So fungi, worms, bacteria, protozoans, insects, even burrowing animals help to get that organic matter incorporated into the soil. And this dead stuff is called detritus, which is just dead organic matter. The humus is the term, so this is not hummus, this is not a snack treat. Humus is the undecayed residue from organic matter. Humus accumulates at the bottom of the O horizon, and it's wonderfully important because it holds so much water and nutrients. So humus can hold up to 100 times the capacity of a clay soil to retain that water and nutrients. Humus also helps to hold soil particles together, and if you've ever bought compost at the store to put on a garden, compost is primarily humus. So it's that undecayed organic matter that's in the process of decaying. All right, so soil texture, we said the percent of clay in a soil is critically important, so organic matter and clay. And so soil scientists typically describe a soil in terms of its texture, which just describes the amount of different sediment sizes that are present in the soil. So the different size of sediments you find in soil are sand. These are the particles that would be visible to your naked eye. So if you picked up some soil and you could see the grains of soil particles, those are probably sand. The slightly smaller particles are silt, and then clay would be the really fine particles that almost look like flour, except they might not be the same color, but they're very fine and they feel kind of silky smooth. There's also in soil, especially out in the desert in Arizona where I live, gravel, cobbles, boulders. So any particles that are larger than sand would be called gravel, or if they're really large, boulders. So this types of soil size particles that are present depends on the parent material, so what type of rock was weathered in order to create these particles, and then also how much weathering has the sediment been subjected to, so over time it will get smaller. And so when you describe a soil texture, it's just a fast way to tell people how much water and nutrients that soil can probably hold on to. Often, so if you wanted to describe a soil, you wouldn't normally tell people, okay, this is what percent sand, silt, and clay is in a soil. Instead, you would tell them the soil texture classification. So just like we classify animals, we classify soil into different textures. And depending on how much clay, silt, or sand is present in the soil, they have different names. So if your soil is all silt, then you're going to have the soil is called silt. If the soil is basically all clay particles, then you have clay soil. The sweet spot, so the type of soil that really grows plants the best, are loam soils. So anything that's in here in this middle range that has a higher percentage, it still has a fair amount of clay in it, but it also has a good mixture of silt and sand in it. Those are going to be the best for growing plants. So these soils, they have enough clay that they can hold on to water and nutrients, but they have enough sand and silt that the water can also drain through the soils and your plants can respire.